Good morning, everybody. New kind of headset for me. So I can't thank Adidas enough for their setup. Actually, it's very funny. We have a lot of very similar kinds of points in our topics today. I lead the API and gateway strategy for IBM for our products and for what we're doing in open source. And so what we wanted to do today is really talk about open source methods for really attacking the API space, how you create microservices, and how you make them scale. So one of the things that's really important, and this goes to businesses, to startups, to anybody in this space, is that there are 274,000 startups a day that are starting up in this software space. And what that really means to all of us is, depending on how we approach APIs and microservices, it's either a fantastic opportunity or it's a really bad choice in terms of competition. As was said before, one of the most interesting things about the API space is that you can very easily get started, but many companies crash and burn in this space because they just don't take the right approach. And so as you start to create APIs, use tools, mature, you get lots of usage out of your API and your microservices, the scalability, the security, all those kinds of things start to come into play in a big way. And most of us have heard of very many companies who've kind of gone down this road and totally changed strategies, right? And that's not just because of tool choices. It's a lot of the things that were discussed before in terms of process and gearing up with the right skills and all those kinds of things. But it's quite important that as you get started in an API program, that you are not focused just on kind of creating. Create is very important, of course, but you do have to have strategy behind what you're doing. Otherwise, you'll end up with a bunch of APIs that you can't manage that don't really have any use for you. So microservices and APIs are products, and we all need to be thinking about them that way. And that's for a large number of reasons. These are just a few of them. But as you start to put APIs out there, people rely on them, and they rely on them as part of their business. If they're great APIs, you're going to get a ton of usage out of them. And that's really a key aspect of what you're doing in this space to become something that's performant, to become something that scales, something that as you get these large numbers of consumers and people using your APIs and microservices, that there is a reliance on you as a business and what you're providing to them as a piece of valued software. And so that's really a key aspect and a key point of the way you need to think about your business, your work in the API space, because what I would tell you is that many companies start out with kind of just, let's create something, let's get something out there real quickly. And we've all heard the terrible term, and I think it's a terrible term, fail fast. Fail fast is not actually a good concept. You want to get something out there that's fantastic on first run, right? And then that doesn't mean you take tons of time, but you want to do it fantastic first run and keep evolving it, make it better, get more and more kind of interest in it. If it's really bad in the beginning, you're not going to have people who want to stick with you, especially if it doesn't perform and they can't rely on you. So, really think about this as something that is critical in the way that you approach your APIs. Of course, you can put things in market and test them really quickly. That's a great approach, but you don't want to fail. That is really not the way to go. So there's a lot of different approaches to serverless. And so one of the things that's really important to think about is there's kind of serverless just from the standpoint of being able to fire some triggers on events and kind of take those as functions in an application or an API or a microservice and do something with them. What we've done at IBM is we've worked with Apache to release OpenWhisk. And what OpenWhisk is all about is a separation of concerns. And we did this really because we focused on this space for over 2 years and looked at kind of what are the actual challenges of creating an API that works really effectively, that will scale very dynamically. And so when you look at what we're doing in OpenWhisk, it's really a focus around separation of those concerns, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But it really requires a number of different things to support developers the way that you need to, including multi-language. We all know that you're using different languages on the front end than the back end most times. And even in that world, many times you're using multiple languages in the back end to the various different systems. And so your ability to support both multi-cloud and to be able to support multi-language is quite important. So when you kind of bounce through this, the way that we've really focused on this is that there are source events or triggers. Those are separated from a set of rules that you also have there to apply, and then a set of actions. And by result, what that really provides for you is an ability to scale very, very strongly across these different things, because it's many to many, right? This is not a one trigger to one action kind of scenario. You can create many different rules that process differently based on the types of triggers. You can do very many actions against that, depending on what you're trying to do. And we'll have some examples of that in a moment. But when you think about it, the key here is that I may want to have one trigger spawn a ton of different actions, or vice versa. I may want, one trigger that actually starts from a source event, to go through a number of different rules and apply it differently based on what kind of input I'm getting. So this one is really important because as I go through it, it allows me to create these very complex architectures, but I can start as simply as I want and with, one-to-one actions if that's the way to begin. But as I get more mature and I really want to apply more variance or more spawning of rules as a part of that, I can do that very easily. So in serverless, one of the things that's challenging is really security, because again, by virtue of what it is, there's not a whole bunch of heavy architecture around it, right? You want to be able to be fast, you want to be able to create these functions and move through them very rapidly. There's a number of different things that can impact APIs and microservices in this area, including the access requirements that you get. You want to make APIs easy to use. You don't want to create a situation where they're very difficult to get to, very difficult to use, very complex in authenticating through. And so, when you start thinking about security as a part of this, you just want to have it as a concern and really focus on how you're going to manage it as you go through. And we'll talk about some strategies for doing that as well. So as you secure these APIs and microservices when you create them, there's a number of different ways to do it. A gateway is one way, and we're talking about that today just because that's one of the things that we do. But when you think about how you do it, it really comes down to defined endpoints and then a number of different rules that you can put around the way that you process the data behind it. So in this case, we've got a gateway. It's proxying to the back end. It's looking at all the traffic as it goes through. It also provides for things like security and things like translation, if you need to do that, like from one format to another to the back end. And this is many times a very simplified way of getting to some of the challenges that you otherwise would have. On the front end, if I've got an API, it's communicating in some language, and you need to actually translate that into something else for consumption on the back end. That's one of the things you can do in that gateway layer. When you get to OpenWhisk, of course, you have the process that you can flow through to spawn different actions, and then whatever you're using in terms of a back-end database, you're doing your CRUD operations there to get what you need. So, when you think about that flow, it's a very simple way of kind of both securing the API and allowing it to be scalable. And OpenWhisk provides for kind of that really fluid way of interacting on the serverless layer. So we already talked about some of these things, but I think one of the things that's important too, and it was mentioned in the Adidas presentation as well, is throttling. Because as you start to leverage these APIs and microservices in a big way, it will not work if you don't have some way of throttling or rate limiting the consumption. Most of us who put out APIs regularly understand that there's different forms of traffic here, right? Some is maybe potentially vital to your business. It's where you make your money. Or it's the kind of traffic that's priority for some reason for that customer. But then there's a lot of traffic that may not be as important, or it's a certain partner that you're dealing with that's more critical, or customer that's more critical. And so you need to be able to rate that throttling for those different clients or for those different traffics in a way that works by itself. You don't want to have to be looking at that all the time and concerned about consumption and whether you're going to be able to reach what you need to for contracts, for example. So the flexibility, obviously, is hugely important for microservices. Now, it's quite interesting because when you're working in the real world with APIs and you've created these microservices that take on a life, you start to have to scale across clouds. You have to be able to scale from your on-prem cloud into public clouds many times as well. And so really having an honest concept of how you're going to do that at some point is important. Now, when you think about any cloud, that doesn't mean just throw it in a Docker container and it runs anywhere, right? That's great. However, it needs to run effectively in those environments. Docker and Kubernetes help us a lot there. However, you really want to operationalize how you're going to do this. If you're thinking ahead on the consumption of your API, whether it's running internally only or it's going to span into public cloud and be something publicly consumable, you really need to have that kind of architectural view of what you're going to do for scale. In terms of any form factor, this really comes down to the ability to understand how you're going to architect for the other parts of what you're doing. So cloud hosting obviously is where you put it and where it's going to run and all that kind of thing. Any form factor is more about, how it runs in those various different places. You're going to have a topology. You're going to have some kind of gateway component or securing component for your APIs that are public, of course. And then from a microservice standpoint, you really need that ability to make them work together effectively. And I don't know how many of you are API developers in the room? Ah, fantastic. Good crowd. Okay. All right. So this is a challenge that many of you have dealt with, I'm sure, but you start getting microservices out there, you want them to interact in a way that's dynamic and that you can actually add to and make change. And so as a part of that, you need to manage all of those effectively, but then we'll also talk a little bit about how you orchestrate the services. From an API management perspective, it was touched on several times in Adiz's presentation about how you have to kind of have that central place for people to consume your APIs. You need to be able to apply policy to those APIs. You also have to be able to really understand the usage of those things. For anyone who has not invested large in APIs yet, one of the things that's very difficult, and we have a lot of clients who've gone here, is if you start that engine going and you start pumping out APIs and microservices, suddenly you have thousands of these things. And a lot of cases, you don't know if they're even used, what kind of priority they have, all these kinds of things that start to be challenges in both the investment in these areas, but also just in the general management. And so you need that overarching control that helps you understand, is this an API that's of value to our company? Is anybody actually using it? What kind of usage are we getting? When are we getting that usage? Like all of these different things that really tell us, how valuable it is to us and if it's working effectively as well. So those are just a few of the areas. In terms of developer portal, it's really important that not only do you get that API out there and that it's very consumable and easy to get to, but that as you evolve that API and deprecate and make change, as was talked about before, it's easy for the developer to get to it, and it's very easy for them to kind of understand what's new, what's coming, that kind of thing. So when you think about integration of that tooling, there's a lot of different parts to this, and you saw it very well in the first presentation today. It's all the way from the integrated user experience across to how you actually process all of the things that are coming through your APIs and microservices. Having analytics and an understanding of the usage, like we were just talking about before, as well as security, rate limiting, and then the ability to fast socialize your APIs as you create them and get them out, understand their usage, and then at the last, kind of scalable. And, we all hope that what we create has value, right, and big value, and hopefully, gets consumed a lot. That's a great problem to have, right? You'd rather have that than put out the API that nobody ever wants, which is pretty regular. But if you think about that, that does create the challenge of how I take it to the next level. And so here, we wanted to talk really about inner microservice work. So as you create these APIs and microservices, you need to orchestrate them. You want them to work together because they're building blocks. And whether you talk about, taking monoliths and breaking them down, or it's all net new native application creation, microservices really come together in a way that's quite important. And if you're doing it right, it's not just very modular, but you have an ability to build these things and orchestrate them and really evolve your business very fast with these because you have squads working on the different microservices. As each one evolves, you have new features coming, you have new capabilities that come out very quickly. And so when you think about that inter-service communication, the ability to scale that rapidly and coordinate it as you create new is really quite important. And so this one, when we think about the communication between the various different microservices and how you manage that, IBM has started or has released something called Istio. How many of you heard of Istio? Quite a few. Okay, good. So Istio is a partnership with Google and with Lyft. And we put out basically what is a ability to orchestrate between microservices and manage that orchestration as well. And this is open source, it's consumable out there, and I'll actually have URLs later in here for how to access all this stuff. But the main point here is that it's non-intrusive. We took the approach here of coming out with something that was an open specification, would provide for an ability to create this orchestration very easily, very rapidly, both for speed, but also for ease of the developer. And by virtue of what we've done with Istio, you've got really a flexible platform that allows you to grow your microservices interaction very rapidly. And so when you think about that pluggable decision maker called a mixer, what that's really doing for you is you have, again, kind of that separation of concerns that we were talking about similarly to OpenWhisk, where the descriptions and the way that the service interacts between the various microservices is separate from the microservices themselves. So of course that allows you to infinitely scale how these different microservices work together and actually change that interaction over time. So as you evolve a microservice, you may need new interaction of some kind. It's very easy to apply new kind of orchestration between them as you do that. And as you scale, obviously you'll need more and more of this kind of management between your nodes. So, as a part of that, you need or you want to be able to expose these things rapidly, as we talked about before. A gateway provides for a good ability to do that and also secure it and translate, as we talked about. And then when you think about where Istio is fitting in, as we said, it's between the different pieces, really providing for that orchestrator that scales. So one of the things that we would actually challenge you guys to try is microservices in 30 seconds. And this sounds very gimmicky, but it is quite easy to do. So what we've done is we've combined these services with the work we've done with Cloud Foundry and really released them in Bluemix under the OpenWhisk service to provide an ability to not only quickly create the APIs, but apply the security we talked about, the scalability we talked about, and do it very rapidly. And so, as you think through how you kind of go to the next generation, especially around scale and security, we're providing all of that in this one flow. This is free. As I said, it's open source, so it's not anything that IBM's hooking you on, just to warn you. So when you think about the future here, it comes largely back to a lot of the things that we were talking about in the beginning in terms of being a product. If you have things built in mind that have scale, can scale automatically, aren't going to require you to build some kind of unique thing to help you scale or change technologies as you move into more advanced APIs, then you obviously have solved one of the big problems that many companies have had to re-engineer around. Many companies are on their second API program today, or third even in some cases, and that's because they've started kind of from grassroots. That's not a bad place to start, but many times what that does mean is there wasn't a lot of thought put into what's going to happen when we have mass consumption, right? Or when we get to very large adoption. Also, that simplified backend management becomes huge once you get into large numbers of APIs. As I said, not just understanding what's used and how much it's consumed, but also what you do with those APIs, how you deprecate them, how long they stay out there, how you notify your developers when you're making big changes in a way that they understand, that they see, that they're not surprised by, all those things. Those are quite important. DevOps is always a challenge. In this space, we try to be very fast, of course. We want to get things out very rapidly. And so your ability to integrate through and use things like Jenkins as an automation is quite important. Cheap. Now, this one always makes me laugh because depending on who you're talking to, cheap is not necessarily a thing that they worry about. I think most API programs are starting to get a lot of business analysis, and that is a good and a bad thing, right? For anybody who's a developer, the bad thing is that kind of carte blanche of just building cool stuff sometimes gets knocked out when you start to get there, which is unfortunate. But, you know, having the ability to be able to say, look how many people are using my API, you know, and really understand the value to the business is quite critical. And that's from the developer all the way through the business guys, right? Because if you have that, not only are you able to show the value of what you've done, but it kind of gives you the value going forward with the other things you want to do, right? And then finally is the reduced vendor lock-in. Always a concern, right? You always want to be using the technologies that provide the ability to scale, but also that aren't suddenly going to hit you with these big bills, right? We've all had the experience of using some service that, you know, we thought was great, and suddenly we're getting charges that we wouldn't expect. And that is definitely not something that we want to deal with, much less kind of lock in where we can no longer kind of take it to the next cloud or take it to the next environment. So here we wanted to provide a couple of resources. Depending on where you are in your API journey, we've got many different places to start or to use our technologies and the open source projects as well here as a help yourself. We also have programs for the business. And one of the things that I would tell all of you is, in our experience in working with companies, one of the biggest challenges many times is the wedding between the business and the technology guys, right? There's great ideas floating out there, but there's not an understanding of how to actually bring them to life many times, and vice versa. Many times the technology teams and the developers really understand the best way to get there, but they don't necessarily have the really good interaction with the business teams to understand the value of what they're doing. And so here on the right-hand, or your right-hand side, we've got a couple of different workshops that we do that really focus on bringing the business teams and the technology teams together. And that's both to get that similar reality, but we run this as a design program. It's in our garages. We can also do it you know, with our customers in their business. But we focus on these very heavily because what we find many times is the mileage that companies get out of these is very, very drastic, because it brings everybody together to a similar reality, to a focus point, even to, in the second one, a roadmap that you can build out over a couple of years for what you're going to do around APIs and microservices. Sometimes, you know, companies are very internally focused. It's more break down the monolith, you know, internal APIs, that kind of thing. We really try to focus with our customers on the external, not just because that's a hot place to be, but that's where a lot of times companies find the highest value in APIs, right, and microservices, because you're providing something to the world, whether that's a new channel for data or whether it's a new way of getting revenue, whatever it is. There's a team of people that are really kind of in these workshops able to help orient you guys around what is business value for you. And that could be internal APIs, but many times it's external. So I would ask you all to kind of take a look and think what you can do with these resources. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you guys for questions, and thank you very much.